Decisions about the right to die, about abortion, about terminal illness, prolonged coma, transplantation, decisions about life and death. But society isn't deciding. Congress isn't deciding. The courts aren't deciding. Religion isn't deciding. Why? Because society's leaving it up to us, the experts, the doctors.
It's a war being fought in your body.
We should have the right to choose the kind of care that we want.
It's a corporate zeitgeist. It's much more profitable to fix things than to prevent things. It's much more profitable to chalk up hospital stays than to help people stay out of it.
We can't tell them everything. Our job is to make things easier for them. I'm sure you agree.
You're killing people.
We must always take the long view. Not of the individual, but of society as a whole. Because medicine is now a great social force. The individual is too small.
We have a system of medicine that's broken, that by itself is killing at least 700,000 people a year. Some people are dying since they don't have health insurance, but what about the number of people who are dying because of the current system?
I wonder if you can understand. If you can take the long view.
All the industrialized democratic countries have found a way to have universal health care sponsored and guaranteed by the government. $2.3 trillion, 1/6 of our whole gross domestic product, $7,200 for every person in this country, and twice as much as the next 3 countries in the world, Switzerland, France, Germany. We spend $7,200 per capita, they spend $3,200.
Because Americans believe in medical care. These great hospital complexes are the cathedrals of our age. Billions of dollars, thousands of beds, a whole nation of sick people turning to us for help.
Because of the poisons that are being injected into people, even though they're called therapies, because of the disinformation that is given to patients by our drug companies and our misinformed physicians, the number of people dying from that dwarfs the numbers of Americans who sadly are dying from lack of care.
Okay, now just sit up. Come on, that's it. That's good. Yes, here we go. It's the drug. Yes, it's gonna be just fine. Doctors make the worst patients. They know.
Every chronic disease is a massive profit producer for the people who produce drugs. Every single one of them. These things exist not so much because they were allowed to exist as because they were created. So that you can call it ADD, you can call it obesity, whatever it is, when you have people who go from the age of, let's say, 15 to the age of 65 in a chronic depressed health situation, massive amounts of profit are made off each one of those individuals.
Somebody has to make these decisions. We can't wait around forever. If society won't decide, we'll decide. We'll make the hard decisions.
When the Rockefellers took over the allopathic medicine, the Rockefellers were also in charge of the oil industry and the chemical industry, and they also made an alliance with a huge German concern called IG Pharma, which was a big chemical industry in Germany.
The healthcare that we need is more on the acute traumatic healthcare, where we have services that are and phenomenal surgeons and neurosurgeons and orthopedic surgeons that can address the traumas that result from being involved in accidents that cannot be altered by traditional lifestyle approaches.
One friend of mine went to Harvard Business School, and on his very first day in class, they were given a test case that you're a drug company, and a couple of people have died from your over-the-counter drug. What do? Do you recall the drug? Do you calculate the damages? What? And my friend, who didn't know yet how things operated in this school, immediately said, recall the product. And everybody laughed in the room, and the teacher said, "Have you calculated how many lives you can afford to lose before you need to recall?"
You've been asking about Wanza Kalulu. She's under there, covered in quicklime. Her and 62 others who never officially existed.
Pharmaceutical companies lobby Congress directly. They lobby decision makers and influence policy decisions. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't stop there. The pharmaceutical industry, also through direct-to-consumer advertising, creates a demand for their products with oftentimes misleading ads.
More and more of that research is actually funded directly by medical schools themselves.
Disposable drugs for disposable patients. Out here, they have absolutely no shelf life. Safest thing to do is incinerate
them. There's going to come a day where we are all of us, adults and children alike, are diagnosed with at least one disorder, maybe up to a dozen disorders, and we are put on mandatory medications. And if we disagree with that, they'll say we suffer from obedience defiance disorder, and we'll be put on a different set of drugs to treat that disorder, or we'll be thrown in jail until we agree to take those drugs. It's that crazy.
The companies are hiring reps that really have no science or medical background. They are not doctors typically, they are not pharmacists, they are not nurses. They're oftentimes business majors and music majors and drama majors, and they're telling your doctors how to prescribe drugs to you, the patient.
Cheap trials for unsound drugs, uninformed consent extorted with threats against children, payoffs, cover-ups,
You're in Nairobi.
unmarked graves,
I knew I'd seen you
murder.
I was being told to minimize side effects, that I was disseminating misinformation and disinformation campaigns. I knew that I was not giving fair, balanced information to doctors, therefore doctors couldn't give fair, balanced information to their patients. So I started being disheartened while I was still in the industry about the industry itself, because I knew that the job that I was originally taxed to do, that wasn't what my job was anymore, that my job was a marketing job, that I was there to build the bottom line of the company, that I was there to grow market share and influence physicians' prescribing habits.
Big pharmaceuticals, they're right up there with the arms dealers. This is how the world fucks Africa, Mr. Black. Blood on their hands. It's how they expiate their guilt. Pharmaceuticals, the aid agencies, everybody. This whole machine is driven by guilt.
While I was a pharmaceutical sales representative, when we were interacting with physicians, we were constantly trying to downplay side effects, minimize side effects, if those questions were raised by the physician. And we were trained to skillfully sidestep those questions and to not provide full disclosure about the potential devastating effects of certain medications.
A particularly egregious drug that the FDA allowed to come into the market was called Ketek, K-E-T-E-K. It was supposed to be used for antibiotic-resistant infections. Unfortunately, it promoted liver failure. It turns out that the studies that were done to validate the safety weren't done. In fact, the doctor who was overseeing these studies received $400 per patient and enrolled 400 fictitious people into these studies and showed that, of course, none of these people had any adverse effects from Ketek because, of course, these people didn't exist. Now, here's where the story really gets bad. Even after the FDA discovered that the data submitted to them by the company was fraudulent, they still presented it to the congressional investigative committees. The result was the media picked up on this and proclaimed that this drug was shown to be safe in all these studies that never occurred. So the drug Ketek, when it first came out, by the way, was selling for over $1,000 for 60 tablets. And it's now come down to $285. The company's reduced the price. The FDA allows that drug to stay on the market.
I'm voluntary here, see, I'm not committed. I don't have to stay here. I mean, I can go home anytime I want.
You can go home anytime you want.
That's it.
You're bullshitting me.
No.
He's bullshitting me, right?
No, Randall. He's telling you the truth.
As a matter of fact, there are very few men here who are committed. There's Mr. Bromden, Mr. Tabor, some of the chronics, and you.
Cheswick, you're voluntary?
Mm-hmm.
Scanlon? Billy, for Christ's sakes, you must be committed, right? No. I mean, you're just a young kid. What are you doing here? You ought to be out in a convertible, bird dogging chicks and banging beaver. What are you doing here, for Christ's sake? What's so funny about that? Well, Jesus, I mean, you guys do nothing but complain about how you can't stand it in this place here, and then you haven't got the guts just to walk out? I mean, what do you think you are, for Christ's sake? Crazy or something? Mm-hmm. Well, you're not. You're not. You're no crazier than the average asshole out walking around on the streets, and that's it.
Bayer has known for years that its drug Triazole had all kinds of complications involving kidney shutdown. And Bayer did a study with 67,000 patients. Bayer failed to give their own internal data to the FDA. And before that, Bayer manufactured a blood product called Factor IX. That drug was contaminated with HIV, and an entire generation of hemophiliacs will die of AIDS and HIV. They went to Skid Row to buy blood to use for the manufacture of this product.
This company positively, absolutely knew that they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus. They took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So they made a huge profit. By the way, Joe, government officials in France that allowed that to happen actually had to go to prison for it. In America, not one corporate executive for this company has been indicted or even criminally investigated by our Justice Department.
Why not? Those are very challenging observations you made, Randall. I'm sure some of the men would like to comment. Mr. Scanlon?
I want to know why the dorm is locked in the daytime and on weekends.
Aspirin kills about 1,500 people a year. Glucosamine and chondroitin sulfate kill 0 people per year. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories kill a minimum of 25,000 people a year. When safe, effective, inexpensive alternatives are available that actually promote health, why would anybody use deadly chemicals that are expensive and sure to cause bleeding and other serious side effects and even death, because the information is demonized and suppressed on an economic basis?
So the lobbyists go to Congress and they write a bill. Literally, the Prescription Drug Act that was passed was written by the pharmaceutical industry. They present it to various members of Congress and they say, please pass this bill so that we can use tax dollars to pay these outlandish prices of these prescription drugs.
If you want to know who's in control of the system, you have to look at who are the people at the top of the pharmaceutical industry. You'll have to look at the people who who come in and out of the federal government. For example, who becomes chairman of the CDC, who becomes chairman of the Department of Health and Human Services. Where do they get these people from? So the question is not so much who is in control, but what is the system that they've created? Because now they have a revolving door of people who come in and out of the system who pretty much agree with how the system is working, and they're not going to really change or do anything to the system that might offend it.
No! Nobody's gonna hurt you. Come on.
No!
You'll be all right. Come on.
No!
You're all right. No one's gonna hurt you.
No! Leave me alone!
Make it easy on yourself.
No!
Come on.
Oh,
Come on.
no!
Most politicians, in fact, I would say all politicians, except maybe for a unique few here and there, are trapped inside a system where their ability to hold their jobs, hold their office, depends on having the support of the system that's creating all the problems that we have. There is a belief that the legislative and judicial process that we have that creates our laws is there to protect the public. And that's not correct. That isn't why they came into existence. That's not what they're designed to do.
I won't go! I don't want to go! I won't go!
And so Congress has become really a threat to the health and the safety of the American people. This may sound radical, but in America, people are concerned about terrorism and they're concerned about threats from abroad. Those threats pale in comparison to the threat that is posed by our own Congress working in conspiracy with the pharmaceutical industry.
Drug companies literally monitor what is taught and influence, if not control, what is taught in medical schools. Drug companies also sponsor much of medical school research. So the research budget, a lot of it is derived from drug companies. The federal government used to fund research at medical schools, but now more and more of that research is actually funded directly by medical schools themselves.
Big Pharma spends $60 billion a year on medical research. And we know that the National Institutes of Health only spends $25 billion. And they have a close relationship with one another, which is why you're seeing research being directed towards technology and towards drugs. You're not seeing it directed towards the natural things that don't cost much, that don't provide much profit. So we have a huge conflict of interest there. They're making their point of view from their perspective. And it's a very biased point of view that sometimes is outright lies and sometimes written by ghostwriters. So they may pay people to be involved with the study. They may have little to do with the study. It may be a very prominent person in the medical standing. And it doesn't change the fact that if they're paid enough money, the ghostwriters come in and write what they want to and slant it the way that they want to.
There is absolutely no question who the FDA works for. They represent the interests of the drug companies, and they viciously attack anyone who presents a challenge to that. If a company has a natural product backed by good scientific knowledge, the FDA will attack them. And the better your product works, the more aggressively you'll be attacked. You will be threatened with being arrested and thrown in jail. You'll have your products confiscated, your company shut down. The owners of these companies are so terrified that they won't speak out publicly about what's happening. Behind closed doors, they are being forced to sign consent decrees, where you must agree to admit that you're committing crimes, even though you've never committed a crime. You've only told the truth about an herb or a nutrient or even a dried fruit like cherries. You've told the truth about it, and you have been targeted by the FDA as a criminal.
Now at 10, just one day after a raid on his farm, a local man goes back to selling raw milk. A Loganville dairy farmer is ignoring the state's orders to stop selling raw milk.
Wednesday, state inspectors raided the farm with a search warrant.
While serving the warrant, they not only put tags and tape on the coolers inside the store, they came and poured a dye inside the tank.
Hirschberger promptly started selling again this morning.
The Food and Drug Administration is a captive of the pharmaceutical industry. It's absolutely transparently clear, and it is the subject of numerous whistleblowers' testimony to Congress. FDA medical reviewers have time and again identified drugs as causing severe adverse effects and have warned against approval. And their opinions have been squelched. They've been punished. They've had criminal investigations commenced against them, political witch hunts. They have had their science taken from them and censored. They've been denied the right to communicate at public conferences. There are numerous problems with the drug review process, but it originates from one simple reality, that the drug industry influences to an extraordinary degree the review and approval of drugs.
The drug Premarin, which so many menopausal women were prescribed, Premarin and Prempro, those drugs caused so many cases of breast cancer, so many unnecessary heart attacks and strokes. and yet the FDA still allows those drugs to be sold. There are safer forms of estrogen available. We don't need to have those drugs sitting on the pharmacy shelf anymore. They should be withdrawn from the marketplace, but they generate so much money for the maker of those drugs that they stay on the pharmacy shelf. And the maker of those drugs lobbies the FDA to suppress the ability of companies who make safer, more natural forms of estrogen from promoting that to the public.
FDA's Deputy Director of the Office of Drug Safety, David Graham, has repeatedly stated that there's this undue influence, that essentially he who pays the piper calls the tune.
I would argue that the FDA as currently configured is incapable of protecting America against another Vioxx. We are virtually defenseless. It is important that this committee and the American people understand that what happened with Vioxx is really a symptom of something far more dangerous to the safety of the American people. Simply put, FDA and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research are broken.
When I appeared before the Senate Finance Committee and announced to the world that FDA was incapable of protecting America from unsafe drugs or from another Vioxx, FDA is responsible for 140,000 heart attacks, 60,000 dead Americans. That's as many people as were killed in the Vietnam War. Within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, about 80% of the resources are geared towards the approval of new drugs, and 20% is for everything else. Drug safety is about 5%. Congress has created that structure by PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, by which drug companies pay money to FDA so that FDA will review and approve its drugs. For industry, every day that a drug is held up from being marketed, in their minds, that's another $1 to $2 million of profit that they're being denied. And so the incentive is really review the drugs as quickly as possible, approve them as quickly as possible, and don't stand in the way of our making profit.
There's a strong bias in favor of approval. In the case of Vioxx, for example, they had a meeting with then FDA Commissioner Lester Crawford, and these scientists urged him to take action against this drug and get it off the market. What did he do? He said the information was all anecdotal. He announced that he would approve the drug for pediatric use. And what happened to Lester Crawford when he left the FDA? He failed to reveal his ownership interests in large food companies and some pharmaceutical companies. This was discovered, there were investigations that took place, and so he came up on federal charges, and he resigned as commissioner of the FDA. He was going to be prosecuted, and he struck a deal and avoided a prison term. And then what happened to him? Well, he went to work for a lobbying firm in Washington that is one of the lobbying firms for Merck, the company that made Vioxx, and he makes an extremely handsome salary. Here is a person who was responsible for decisions that imperiled the lives and indeed actually cost the lives of human beings. And he is not penalized for this. He's not subject to any criminal prosecution for what he did. Instead, he's rewarded handsomely.
The literature that comes out of the research, and you look at say, the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, those are the big journals, and all of those journals have to be financed. And how do they get financed? They get financed by the drug companies. So the drug companies basically are very involved in financing medical research. And the problem with that is this: they're not disinterested parties. They are interested in having an outcome that will show that their particular product is a workable product. And this, of course, has led to disastrous consequences, which we know because it has been widely reported that over 100,000 people every year are killed by one of these pharmaceutical products.
Now, if you look at any of these journals, it doesn't matter which, you will see incredible ads from the drug companies. When you see an ad from the drug company, look at the article that follows it and notice the article actually pertains to that particular drug. You'll also see that the researchers who did the article, more likely than not, have listed in their disclosure that they received funding, a grant if you will, from the maker of the drug advertised on the prior page. And so then this journal, the American Medical Association, any medical journal you care to look at, is simply an advertising document, not much more or less than a glossy catalog advertising these drugs.
You have people running to specialists who prescribe their medication for that person's symptom, ignores the other medications the person is already on. And we have people who are being over-medicated to the extent that they are poisoning themselves and they don't realize that.
This monopoly of conventional medicine has been propagandized by our mainstream media. You know, the media is supposed to question things. It's supposed to be skeptical. It's supposed to ask the questions as a proxy for the public. But when it comes to conventional medicine, and especially vaccines, the media is blowing the horn of the pharmaceutical industry.
As an award-winning journalist, I'm very upset at the practices I see going on in reporting today when it comes to reporting the actual causes of disease in the American public. And I find that journalists are accepting press releases, they're accepting public relations rather than reading the actual science.
The direct-to-consumer ads are another area that are incredibly inappropriate. There are only two countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer ads, New Zealand and the United States. They spend $5 billion a year on direct-to-consumer ads to try and convince you that the products that they're selling are products that you need.
The medical industry doesn't call what it does propaganda, it calls it advertising. It shows healthy people and it shows healthy people doing healthy things. But in the background, there's this message to tell you that this drug is very dangerous. Your teeth may fall out, your bones may crack, and you may develop cancer. However, this drug is going to be really good for what we're telling you. So the American people have to take their risk, because now the pharmaceutical industry can absolve themselves because they can say, well, you knew the risk, but you took the drug anyway.
There were many mistakes with the healthcare reform that went into place. Number one, they forgot to talk about vitamins and nutrients and how we prevent disease. And then secondly, they took away more freedoms. So we used to have more freedom of choice as consumers and parents and even as cities and states. They took much of that away, and they forced people into a monopoly system, a system that's broken. It does not work except to create profits for the companies that benefit from disease and suffering.
The Healthcare Reform Act, like all of the governmental regulatory structures in place, it puts a stranglehold over medical innovation. We have the federal government coming in and telling doctors what they're allowed to do. It restricts patients from choosing therapies that may be more efficacious.
We're not doing healthcare reform, we're doing insurance reform right now. We're talking about the economics of medicine. We need not only to give everybody health insurance because health insurance or health care because it's a right. It's not a privilege, it's a right. Everybody deserves health care. But it's insufficient to make the healthcare system work because it isn't a healthcare system at all. It's a disease care system.
And I discovered that homeopathy used to be taught in medical schools all across the United States. Well, you certainly wouldn't find it there now. It's considered very alternative and very suspect by mainstream medical people. But the fact is that it was capitalist business interests that made offers to medical schools across the land to move all of medical education into drug-based medicine education.
Medical schools conduct a virtual hazing process they call professional training. After prolonged, intense studies and life and health jeopardizing clinical exposures, medical residents are deprived of sleep, sometimes for days. This form of high-stress, trauma-based education is completely consistent with standardized techniques used in mind control and cult indoctrination programs. This is commonly called brainwashing, but it is really a subtle form of hypnosis that relies on fear and trauma to capture and control your attention and shape your behavior. The end result is you get a heavily trained, egocentric professional that earnestly believes they are operating for the public's greatest good and arrogantly defends their actions based on the limited and limiting science that they have learned.
You must choose chemotherapy. You can't choose an alternative system of healing. You can't even choose to let your own body heal itself. You have to choose their system, or if you're a parent and you have a child with cancer, for example, you could be arrested. You could have your child taken from you by Child Protective Services simply because you do not believe in the system of toxic chemicals that conventional medicine uses to treat cancer today.
I was very grateful that I had the experience and knowledge that I did about the psychiatric drugs that I had sold, because I identified these were drug reactions. So I knew that as my mental state was deteriorating, that it wasn't me, that I wasn't crazy. You know, this was mediated by the drugs that I had taken. And so I just kept clinging to the fact that I had to have a washout, that I had to detoxify the body from the drug. And so I begged my husband and I begged several of my closest friends to not put me in a mental institution, because I had, visited them in my career, and I knew that once that I got behind those closed doors of that mental institution, that they could do anything they wanted to.
Come on, move, man. Hey, go ahead, come on. Come on. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll be seeing you on the outside, you know what I mean? By the time you get out of here, you're too old to even get it up. 68 days, buddy. 68 days. What the fuck you talking about, 68 days? That's in jail, sucker. You still don't know where you at. Yeah, where am I at, Washington? With us, baby. You're with us. And you're gonna stay with us until we let you go.